Hello everyone and welcome back to a very cold, frigid, icy, frozen, Arctic mossy bottom here in the southwest of Finland. Though you wouldn't know it's the southwest, with temperatures hitting minus 26 degrees Celsius here at my home. That's minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. It's more what you'd expect up in Svalbard at this time of year. Here in the Turku region, the average lows for January are about -7, so at -26, we are well below that. And the further north you go here in Finland, the colder it gets. As low as -44 has been recorded in the last few days, according to Finnish news. Speaking of which, this is apparently the coldest winter here in the Nordic countries for 20 years, causing widespread traffic and travel disruption here and in Sweden too, I've read. And I've been living here in my 100-year-old drafty house with broken windows for how many months now? Since September, so 4 months. The question, naturally, which everyone is asking me in person, in comments and messages, is how are you coping with that cold? And this video is my attempt to answer that question. The first thing to say is that every problem you encounter at this kind of temperature is solvable, or at the very least manageable, if you are well prepared, which we couldn't be entirely this first winter because we've only been here in Finland for a few months. And yes, we do live here full time, by the way, there's no second home. But I know that every Finn watching this video will have infinite solutions to all the challenges associated with these very cold temperatures, because you have to. So if you are Finnish watching this video, I'm sorry, I know you're probably going to be shouting at your screen, well, of course that's what happens, you should be doing it this way. I get it, and rest assured we have Finnish neighbours who are giving us lots of tips and advice, as well as doing plenty of research and learning, of course, which I think is half the fun. As for how I'm coping, well, when it gets this cold, you have to focus a bit more on survival, especially when you have a young family, as I now do. And that focus eats into your time every day. Choosing the right clothes to wear. Wool is really effective here because there's no wind outside, unlike in Ireland, of course. Making sure that you have enough firewood, prepared, seasoned, stacked. De-icing vehicles so you can get to the shop to buy basic supplies, and so on. But that focus also simplifies life in a strangely satisfying way. As a child, one of my happiest memories was actually when the electricity went out, which would happen occasionally during storms, especially back in the 80s. I can vividly remember everyone scrambling in the darkness trying to find that box of candles stashed under the stairs, or the one torch that we had as a family, which someone had forgotten to put back. And then huddling around the kitchen table, talking by candlelight, usually about if we had enough food in the house to survive the 1 or 2 hours until the electricity inevitably came back on again. There was no worrying about homework or jobs or chores or all the endless choices in life, which now 30 years later have only increased. It was just, how do we get through this together as a family? And that's sort of what this winter in Finland has felt like so far for me. And yes, the cold is hard, but hard is good sometimes. I think that's something people forget. It simplifies and unites your purpose with the people around you. Unless you're Finnish, of course, in which case you just disappear into a sauna for 6 months. I get it now. Okay, so the first thing to point out when it gets below about -5 is that snow isn't snow anymore. It rapidly turns into ice. And when it gets to -15 or -20, as it is now, that ice, which once was snow and Still looks like snow, feels more like rock. You can't really plough it, maybe with a big tractor, but not by hand, and you certainly can't make snowballs out of it. I can't believe I'm doing this. So in urban areas here in Finland, car parks and street corners, there are giant ice mountains everywhere where snow that was ploughed by tractors and other machines has then frozen solid, which I very much expect to get bigger and bigger as the winter progresses. It's been documented that Finns are some of the best drivers in the world, and the reason for that may be because of how challenging driving conditions are in the winter here. Of course, ice makes the roads slippery. That's obvious, same in other countries. So everyone, including us, uses winter tyres with metal studs on to improve grip and four-wheel drive if you have it. Even then though, a small mistake can be very costly. But something I hadn't considered before moving here is that once that layer of snow freezes on the roads, you can no longer see road markings. There are no lane boundaries, directional arrows, parking spaces. Every part of the road is permanently painted white until, well, probably April. As for cat's eyes, those tiny reflectors built into roads, the middle and the side, forget it, there are none here, which is logical because for 6 months of the year they'd be buried in snow, so what's the point? Without road markings or adequate lighting, and with black ice at every corner, driving is much more dependent on intuition, especially on country roads which aren't doused with sand or grit very often. Ours isn't. So if you want to hone your driving skills, well, just move to rural Finland. And then there's this. It looks like fluffy snow, doesn't it? I assure you it isn't. That was painful. Even if you clear the snow and ice off, moisture in the air sticks to your car and freezes every day. You then drive the car, warming that ice, which causes it to refreeze even harder and in bigger clumps. Day after day, until a week later, your car is basically entombed in ice and undrivable. The number plate isn't readable, the wipers won't wipe, heck, they're just frozen to the windscreen under there. And perhaps most problematically, the doors don't open. At -20, we have to pour several buckets of warm water over each door around the edge just to open it. The problem with that is that that water refreezes again so quickly that by the time you've got into the car and closed the door behind you, that warm water is ice, locking you inside because it seals the edge of the door. Usually you can push open the doors with enough brute force from the inside, but when it's the boot which this happens to, you've got no chance. Heck, even the button under there to open the boot is covered in a 1 or 2 centimetre thick layer of ice. If you've got enough warm water on hand, because you're at your house, you can always get in that way, but if you're already in the car, then don't expect the car fans to melt the ice, because at -20, even probably -15, the most you can hope for is that the air inside the car will warm up a bit. The ice on the outside will not melt. As for the windscreen, well, the warm water method does work, but again, it freezes so quickly, even if it's hot water, which you shouldn't really use, that you actually make the problem worse, reducing visibility. You can melt the ice, but 30 seconds later, it's frozen again. It's then almost impossible to scrape off because of the way it dries until the internal temperature in the car rises. The solution? Car covers and tarps, forget it. They just freeze to the car and don't stop ice forming underneath. A better option is a car heater set up on a timer, which luckily we now have. Run that for a while before you get in the car, and it warms the internal surface enough to stop the warm water, which you still have to pour on the outside, from then refreezing. And yes, I know what you're thinking. The real solution would just be to build a garage. Ah, my life for a garage right now, folks. When it was between freezing, 0, and -5, we had regular snow here. Well, that was a joy. I even started making this, an igloo. But then the snow turned to ice, and my half-built igloo turned into an ice glue. To finish this, I need wet, sticky snow, which is completely impossible when it's -25, as it is today. Heck, there's no way to even make the blocks to keep building this. But I am determined to finish it, so stay tuned to my Instagram channel for updates. Assuming, that is, it does get a bit warmer again in the coming weeks. And yes, I do know that igloos are not culturally Finnish. Thank you for the comments. But I made one much like this with my dad as a kid. And ever since then, I've honestly been counting the days until I could make another. It only took 33 years. The other big problem when it drops to -20 is that no matter what you wear, your extremities will not stay warm for very long, unless you're doing really hard physical exercise. Right now I'm wearing 2 pairs of very thick pure wool socks. Thank you, by the way, to the very kind soul who sent them to me. And well insulated snow boots rated to about -30. But after 30 minutes outside, my toes feel like they're frozen solid. And if you don't come in at that point and warm them up, then I'm told there's a very real danger of lasting damage. I have heated gloves as well, which work to prevent the same problem with your fingers, and they do work really well despite what skeptics say. The downside is that they restrict what you can do in terms of work, like all thick winter gloves. With a thick coat like this and ski trousers and thermal layers underneath, which I have, my core and legs really aren't ever cold, even at this temperature, -25. And that's largely because there's no wind here to whip through the seams. In fact, honestly, my core has been far colder in Ireland when it's 0 degrees and very windy. That combination just chills you to the bone. But it is quite scary how quickly your toes and fingers will freeze here if you're not careful. The blood vessels in your ears, your cheeks and nose can burst very quickly too. I've come to realise when it's kind of -10 or below, there's a window of about 30 minutes in which you can do outdoor jobs, at least the non-physical ones. Then you just have to come inside and warm your toes up by the fire. Or get out the sled and do something that gets the old heart pounding. Finally into the house, and I'm going to show you the 2 stoves which we are very lucky to have. The first in the living room is this, called in Finnish, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, so I apologise in advance, a pöntöuuni. This stove has a metal frame filled with masonry, stone and brick, and is built up in layers. You can see the seams or joints between the different layers here. And the idea is to use the thermal mass of the masonry to store heat. And these things are very common in older houses in Nordic countries like Finland. An essential feature is just up there, the baffles or dampers, which allow you to close the flue, stopping warm air from rising and sucking all that stored heat out of the house with it. Of course, you need to be very certain that all the embers are fully out before closing the damper. Otherwise, carbon monoxide will leak into the house. And yes, we have carbon monoxide monitors everywhere. 2 in this room, 2 in the kitchen, 1 in the hallway, 1 upstairs. We're not taking any chances. We also have vents in here for oxygen intake. Incidentally, I absolutely love this stove. It's the best I've ever used, and I've used quite a few in my life. Though admittedly, it does need a paint job, which I'm working on like so many other things. In the kitchen there is this, a newer masonry stove, which was built to replace the old cast iron stove which now lives in the barn, and you will have seen in my property tour video. And this again is built on the same principle. Keep the door closed, store heat in the masonry, then when the embers are completely out, close the damper which is up there and use the stove as a radiator overnight. It's brilliantly simple, but impressively sophisticated too, especially when you consider that this type of stove and others like it have been in use for hundreds of years here in Finland. The flue chamber goes down before it goes up again, and gases are reburnt, so there's hardly any smoke coming out the chimney. It's basically a rocket mass heater without the bench part for thermal mass. I guess they just didn't have enough space for that in most houses. Our house here is only about 80 square meters. So how do they perform? Well, of course, it depends on what you put in them. With dry birch, really well, but this winter we don't have much of that, despite buying what we could from neighbours. In future years, things will be a lot easier, we think, as we have that hectare of trees to manage for firewood. We've been able to keep the kitchen and living room reasonably warm, above 15 degrees most of the time, even with temperatures as low as -20 or lower outside. Angela, my partner, would probably prefer it to be a steady 22 degrees in here. She's sat at the table right now, but with broken windows and limited firewood this first year, that just isn't possible. And yes, we are using the stoves as local professionals have advised us to. We had them cleaned and checked before lighting a single fire. And yes, we know about sealing windows with tape and plugging gaps between floorboards and walls with old socks or insulation. These things we've done, but -25 is still mighty cold, folks. So, how am I coping with the cold? Well, of course, it's a huge challenge, and at times a real pain in the bum, and the fingers and toes too. But every problem I encounter makes me a little bit excited for implementing a solution. Perhaps I'm a bit of a masochist, I don't know, but I do love solving the simple problems in life. And I actually consider it a privilege to be able to focus on those rather than the trivial things which I used to worry about, and I think most people still do. There are lots more tricky challenges in the cold, like opening wheelie bin lids which freeze shut and operating anything which uses a battery, like cameras for instance, which just don't work below a certain temperature. In fact, I have to admit, filming this video, and it really is below -20 right now, has involved stints of 15 minutes out to film and then 15 minutes back inside to warm up again, change batteries and get the camera going. And I've been doing that for the last 3 or 4 hours. If I hadn't done it, you certainly wouldn't see me smiling right now. But overall, the cold really isn't that bad. At worst, it's an inconvenience, a pretty big one sometimes, but still no more so than the rain and wind which batters the west of Ireland at this time of year. At least the sun comes out here to remind you of what's to come. And best of all, there's no mould anywhere, just ice. So to everyone who's been asking, thank you, we are doing okay. In fact, we're still loving life here in Finland, even in the coldest winter for 20 years. Thank you everyone for watching, supporting the channel through Patreon, and making all those fascinating comments which I love reading too. I didn't realise how popular the Finnish Lapphund is here. That's definitely caught my attention. For now though, my 15 minutes are up. Time to go back inside and warm up my toes. Until the next video, which will be soon, rest assured, take care, throw another bag of logs on the fire, and bye for now. Was
folks worked good and hard for the ones they loved and got above. Each day they punched their card, and when evening came back home again, they'd rest a while and say, "'Tis a hard old life, but for kids and wife we'll work as another day." When the sun rose low, back to work they'd go, singing on their way. Oh, for job and home to call our own, we'll work as another day. Oh, in a Quaker town till 18 years had passed. Then I packed my bags and I said farewell for a better life at last. And for 5 years more I studied hard, and the state paid harder still. For that better life I earned my debt on her education bill. Till I threw my cap and they all did clap and shake my hand and say, "Well done, my son, now work's begun, you'll pay that debt one day."